let's quickly transcend into the next panel discussion, which is all going to be about arbitration, the next legal trends. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about the consequences on contract performance in international arbitration. Is it excusable or not? The rise of investor-state arbitrations, a pandemic arbitration wave. Now, what's that? If you're wondering about this and more, allow me to please welcome the session moderator, Mr. Gaurav Banerjee, the Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. Ladies and gentlemen, welcoming Gaurav with a good round of cheer. Well, to talk about him, he specializes in high stake and high value commercial litigation before the courts, as we know. And he's been a party to various reports that have in fact led to reform in India's arbitration law. Well, he was Additional Solicitor General of India in the Supreme Court from 2009 to 14 and has in fact represented the government of India in a number of important cases. Well, Gaurav, welcoming you right there onto the screen and the virtual stage. Thank you very much for taking the time out and joining us. Well, allow me to please invite the panel members. Let's welcome Mr. Hemant Kumar, the Group General Counsel, Larsen and Toubro. Well, to talk about Mr. Kumar, he is clearly called as a veteran, ladies and gentlemen, in litigations and arbitrations, both under Indian and international disputes, and has in fact extensively dealt in various courts and arbitrations in, say, USA, UK, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, etc. And in fact, when I was researching and in fact reading about him, an LLB gold medalist that he is, he belongs to a family of judges and corporate counsels. So very, very happy to be welcoming you as well, Mr. Kumar. And with that, shortly, he'll be joining us right on the screen. Allow me to also welcome Vikram Nankani, the Senior Counsel, Bombay High Court. Well, Vikram regularly appears before various high courts and the Supreme Court of India and has, to his credit, so proud to share several landmark judgments rendered by the courts. And he's been acknowledged by Legal 500 as a leading individual practitioner in dispute resolution and litigation in India. We warmly welcome you as well. With that, inviting up on the virtual stage Ganesh Chandru, the partner, Dua Associates, who specializes in international as well as domestic arbitration as well as commercial litigation. In fact, he's admitted to practice in India, England, Wales, and Singapore. Yes, there he goes. And with that, also warmly welcome Tejas Karya, FCI ARB partner and head arbitration, Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, India. Well, Tejas, extensive experience for you in handling a broad range of complex, may I say, high value international and domestic commercial disputes, and how you frequently advise your clients across diverse industries, including the oil and gas, real estate, construction, private equity, amongst many others. But before I hand it over to our moderator for the session, allow me to say thank you to our session sponsor, Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, on behalf of Legal Era. And Gaurav, with that, having welcomed all of you on the screen, we submit ourselves to your moderatorship. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I welcome all my co-panelists, each of whom I have known now for over a decade. In fact, I'm privileged because each of them is a leader in their own field. We have three topics which we will discuss. As you know, they are consequences of contract performance in international arbitration. We'll talk about a little about ISTS, and we'll talk about the famous case of Antrix versus Davis, which even yesterday was featuring in the newspaper. But before I actually get on to the topics, I just wanted to go a little bit off topic, because I was listening very carefully to the previous session and indeed the opening. And there is a real, shall we say, really a negative opinion of arbitration, which was being expressed by some very senior people, Dr. Ghemawat, Mr. Jain, It really did concern me because we are, of course, all of us in this panel, all of us are arbitration practitioners. Mr. Hemant Kumar also is an expert in arbitration, and it did concern me. But I genuinely feel, and I would like comments from each of you gentlemen at some point, I genuinely feel that in the last 3 to 5 years, some of these apocryphal stories of 70 or 80 days of cross-examination and hearings going on ad nauseum, people having a cup of tea and adjourning matters, people not doing full day arbitrations. In fact, that was one criticism. Plus, of course, cost. I actually do believe that there has been a transformation. Of course, it is an ongoing process. And definitely, there are a younger lot of people. Some of our new stars, like Ganesh and Tejas are, of course, there. I unfortunately fall in the extinct dinosaur category. Vikram, of course, is young at heart, so I will not put him in my category. But certainly, I would like some comments from you at some point, because this is a little disturbing. But anyway, I should not go too much off topic, because we are here to discuss arbitration, the next legal trends. And of course, one of the most important topics, I think, the first topic is certainly one which I really am looking forward to hearing from. And the format that we have chosen is you will get two voices telling you about one of these topics, and you'll get slightly different perspectives. So the first topic, which is consequences on contract performance in international arbitration, excusable or not, all to do with force majeure, the pandemic, what is the legal experience, what is the practical experience. We have two very, very interesting people speaking to you about it. Ganesh, who I've known through his days in Singapore, Delhi, and now in Chennai. And of course, Mr. Hemant Kumar, who I knew earlier in his earlier avatar, where he was with SR, and now, of course, he's with L&T, and he's got a lot of practical experience on this. So without saying much more, may I ask Ganesh, please, to make some introductory comments on this topic, and what do you think about this very, very important aspect? I think, Ganesh, you're on mute.
Yeah. So this leads to the point made by somebody in the previous session, that in future, for technology arbitration, you would require a team of experts.
I don't know, it's block. I don't know the reason. Okay.
Can you hear me, sir?
I think, Hemant Kumar, sir, you can be heard but can't be seen.
Yeah.
Sir, pardon me, I'm trying my best, but seems some technical glitches.
But you can be heard, Mr. Kumar. There's no problem. We can hear you.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Yeah. Hi again. Thank you, Gaurabji, for that kind introduction. And firstly, for those in Maharashtra and other parts of India celebrating Ganesh Chaturthi, wish you a very, very happy and blessed festival. Before I move to this topic, if I may just take 30 seconds, Gaurabji, on the point that you made about the comments in the previous session. I was equally kind of surprised to hear some of those comments on the arbitration regime in India currently, because personally, I feel, I'm sure others on this panel will share my views, that after the amendment, 2015 amendment, especially to the timeline to which an award has to be made within 12 months. Earlier, it was 12 months from the time the tribunal was constituted. Now it's 12 months from the time the pleadings are closed. I think I've seen a sea change in the way arbitrations are being conducted in the country. Of course, because of the lockdown, now the Section 29A, the limitations have been kind of, because of the Supreme Court order, there's a bit of a, lag there. But otherwise, I think that definitely has changed the way arbitrations has happened in the country. Absolutely no doubt about that. And in terms of fee schedule as well, there are matters where if parties agree and convince the tribunal in the preliminary hearing, even in an ad hoc scenario, that they should perhaps consider following Schedule 4 of the Act, which provides an ad valorem fee structure. There are tribunals agreeing to that as well. But I guess the frustration expressed by the previous panels was probably for matters that are still ongoing from pre-amendment. I'm sure, as you rightly said, it's a work in progress, and I'm There are firms, there was a point saying that there have to be firms where there are full-time arbitration practitioners. I'm sure Tejas has a complete team doing that. I have a team doing that. There are other firms who have just, there's an arbitration, we don't take up court matters. We take them, I'm sure there are quite a lot of firms in India which are now dedicating teams for arbitration. So on that positive note, that yes, definitely there was hitherto a criticism about the way arbitration was conducted in India. But with the 2015 amendment combined with the 2019 amendments, I think it's definitely changed the perspective. And I guess it's I think it's a golden period for arbitration. This will be India's century for arbitration, the world, I feel. That's my personal opinion. And on that note, let me get on to this topic of consequence of contract performance, whether excusable or not. Of course, the topic is a bit kind of when you perform, why should you excuse? What essentially it means that whether in certain circumstances, are you excused from your performance of the contract itself? And this topic has become extremely important, especially because of the current environment that we are in. The world is facing the last 1.5 years because of the COVID pandemic and the way things have happened and evolved, in commercial contracts. One thing which often, especially in the COVID-19 situation, which parties are looking at to escape their obligations from contract, or where genuinely they cannot perform, is the concept of force majeure. Force majeure is essentially it means it's nothing but a French terminology. It means greater force, where you really can't do much, but it's just happened and you can't perform. That's what force majeure essentially means. But for a party to be able to invoke force majeure, at least in common law countries, it's important for a force majeure a provision to be in the contract between the parties in writing. It has to be expressly stated. It cannot be implied, at least in common law countries. In civil law countries, there are certain countries where there's an exception, like in China. I understand in 2020, they came up with an express legislation where even if you don't have force majeure clauses in your contract, by statute, they can, kind of get the advantage of a force majeure and therefore say that they cannot perform. But then that begs the question, what is force majeure? It has to be very clearly defined in the contract, especially in the current scenario. For new contracts, there's no issue. I'm sure everybody is now kind of contemplating and putting pandemic, epidemic, whatever possible into the definition of force majeure. But the problem is for those contracts entered into prior to the situation that we are in today, where what is force majeure? Will it cover pandemic or not? It's of course, it has to be clear. If the definition is wide, I think people have interpreted it saying that it has to be force majeure. And in India, the Indian context, of course, there are judgments like when the Supreme Court in Energy Watchdog versus Central Electricity Regulatory Commission. In that case, they said maybe Section 32 of the Contract Act 1872, which provides for contingent contracts. Maybe that's something akin to a force majeure situation, where the provision itself provides that an uncertain future event happens, rendering an arrangement unenforceable or unworkable, then the contract may be considered void. So therefore, force majeure, which is an unforeseeable circumstance, an unavoidable kind of a condition, yes, I think this is one of the doctrines under which performance can be certainly excused. The other aspect is doctrine of frustration. I'm just giving a broad introduction, after which I think the expert, Mr. Hemant Kumar, will come in. The doctrine of frustration, which is also kind of embodied in our legislation and the Contract Act in Section 56, provides where performance become impossible, then contract is rendered void. This again is not just, it cannot be just a mere impossibility. It has to be a physical impossibility, and it has to be for the entire duration of the contract. And the circumstances, the party who is going to invoke this has to prove that things have fundamentally changed that they cannot perform. So that is the test. And again, this also was discussed by the Supreme Court in the 2017 decision of Energy Watchdog, where in this case, actually, there was an issue where the coal prices in Indonesia were skyrocketing. one of the parties wanted to invoke force majeure as well as frustration. The Supreme Court said that an unexpected rise in price of coal did not absolve generating company from performing their part of the contract. But that case was a little unique because in the contract itself, it was made clear that changes in the cost of fuel or agreement becoming onerous to perform were not force majeure events. So therefore, it was on that facts of the case that the Supreme Court said that. But interesting cases are those that went to court. I'll just quote two, one by the Bombay High Court and one in Delhi. After the pandemic, one was decided in, I think, in March and the other in April. The first case is Standard Retail versus GS Global Corp, where a party said that because of the pandemic and lockdown, the contract has to be terminated. The other party was from Korea. However, the goods involved was steel. So the court said that this is an essential commodity and there was no, therefore, the court said that, no, we cannot grant you the relief that you're asking for. And they had asked for a Section 9 application where they wanted to restrain the respondent bank from invoking the LC. So they said that, no, this is an essential commodity, therefore you cannot invoke force majeure. The other case was Halliburton and Vedanta, where the Delhi High Court did grant an interim injunction. I don't know whether maybe there's a development after that. I'm not sure. Mr. Gaurav Banerjee is laughing, smiling rather. So there the court said that it granted an ad interim injunction against invocation of bank guarantee given by Halliburton to Vedanta. The court held, in that decision, that lockdown caused due to COVID-19 was prima facie a force majeure event. There are a few other cases as well, but I'll stop with that. But the point is, very importantly, if a party wants to invoke this, it's best that they put it expressly in their contract so that they get the advantage of force majeure. And of course, frustration is, Section 56, you can invoke by provision of the statute. You don't really need to have that expressly in your contract. Though parties may be frustrated because of COVID, they don't need to put that expressly in their contract. So with that opening remarks, I hand it over back to the
Thank
chairman.
you, Ganesh. That was in capsule form. You have explained the law so beautifully in 4 or 5 minutes, Energy Watchdog, the various provisions, the judgments of the Delhi High Court. But we will shift gears now, and we welcome Mr. Hemant Kumar, who we can finally see on the screen, to give us a sort of a slightly different perspective from the perspective of a group general counsel. He's had enormous experience. He is not just a lawyer like us. He has experience at different levels and different stages. So without further ado, Mr. Hemant Kumar, we would love to hear from you on the practical aspects of the impact of this pandemic and how it has played out in your experience, Mr. Hemant Kumar.
Thank you, Gauravji, Vikram, Tejas, and Ganesh. And thank you, Legal Era, for giving an opportunity to share our experience. Yeah, Gauravji and my other panelists, it was a challenging period in 2020 when pandemic started. And company like L&T, we are issuing not one, two, thousands of purchase order and signing contract. You remember that this coronavirus started in China in I think 2019 December or January 2010. Now what happens? Huge supply problem. The supply we used to receive from China created a problem because there was a disruption in supply to us. And so back-to-back contract in India between L&T and Indian party, it was impacting us. Impacting in the sense we were to complete the project. So two things was very controversial. One, whether this coronavirus pandemic fall under force majeure. So we were struggling to see the definition. Nowhere I could find that pandemic is covered under force majeure. So and most of our clients are government clients. So they were very silently saying, no, this is not covered under your force majeure clause. So you can't invoke it. And second thing that Ganesh referred watchdog, this energy watchdog case. So another situation was that disruption in China is not going to help you in Indian context. So you have to just honor the contract. But God is great for a company like L&T, and we had to struggle thereafter. On 19th February 2020, Government of India, Ministry of Finance issued a beautiful circular. That circular says very clearly that no pandemic in China, it amounts to force majeure in India. Okay, so energy was not one part gone. Second is that number two is that China pandemic will if impacting in India. So all those contracts you can claim force majeure clause. So I mean, what he said. Luckily, we were saved. In most of the contracts, they are running in hundreds in number. Another situation was very interesting. You remember that sometimes in May or June, Government of India or different state government. So in those, what I intend to convey that in earlier cases, 100 and 122 contract with different party, because of this circular, there was no litigation and amicably matter could be settled. Second situation was a very peculiar situation. That in sometimes June, I remember that there was a partial relaxation in the lockdown. So what happens immediately? Public sector, especially few public sector started writing that now force majeure gone. So you have to ensure 100% production or completion of the job. Here again, a problem arose that whether the partial election amounts to a revocation of the force majeure or not. This was the another situation. So in this context, another circular was issued by Government of India in May 13th May 2020, where they have themselves said that no partial doesn't amount to complete cessation of or a stoppage of the force majeure, and therefore the force majeure is still continuing. So we had to refer this again, that since there is a force majeure, and suppose if there is we are constructing coastal road project, Mumbai Metro. So earlier we used to deploy say 5,000 workers per day. Now because of this lockdown and social distancing, we used to deploy only say 1,000 because social distancing and all these things. So luckily we were saved, and our huge amount blocked for payment of all this, our release of payment that has been released by the government. The third situation was, I think every contractor like L&T has faced, was that you remember that as soon as in India this lockdown started was around March 25th, 26th, Prime Minister addressed the nation. So 29th March, Government of India invoked Disaster Management Act and instructed that you continue to pay wages to all the contract labor. You allow all the medical benefits, and you know our stake was over 1,000 crore for 3 months. 1,000 crore. So we had no option but to comply with, otherwise there is a provision for prosecution. So when we reverted back to my employers, a public PSU and other, they say no, it is not covered under your contract, and therefore you have to bear the expenses. We had to persuade them that no, this Disaster Management Act is equally applicable to you. So luckily, couple of public sector and government department agreed. Okay, we will pay you on actual basis. Fine, you pay the actual basis. But few took a very recalcitrant approach, and they refused to pay this all whatever we have incurred, say for them, because it was their project. It was not L&T. L&T was a contractor only. So overall project, and there are a couple of Supreme Court judgment also. It is finally you are also responsible. These all acts applicable to you. So what happened in this case? Then in some cases we had to invoke Section 70 of the Contract Act, that is quantum merit. And I admit that couple of disputes are pending. We are trying as L&T. We do not believe in litigation much, so we are trying to amicably settle the matter. If they do not settle the matter, then we have no option but to go to the legal recourse. And I endorse Indian arbitration. Let me tell you, having 38 years of experience, I believe that arbitration is working very good. it all depends the strategy of the general counsel. It depends on the that who I'm not going to deal with the strategy. So it all depends your mindset. And if you have a genuine case, there is a process, and within 18 months, 20 months, 24 months, we have recovered the money. I mean, 34 is filed, immediately you have to deposit the amount, and we are withdrawing the amount. So I am great fan of arbitration. Yeah, couple of problems are there that we have to address jointly. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that endorsement. I would be somewhere in between. I think there are still problems that we have, but overall, I think the situation has dramatically improved in the arbitration field. But that is, of course, for the business and industry to look at. But what really interested me, Hemantji, was your practical examples as to how you have worked through this situation of COVID. And I think that's a lesson that at least as lawyers, we should learn, that the first stage is to work and get solutions rather than to jump into arbitration and start citing Energy Watchdog and various other provisions of various acts. And I wonder whether Energy Watchdog would have been decided differently had it been decided in 2021. Maybe the judges would have taken into account the pandemic situation and come to a slightly different conclusion had the facts been different. Anyway, let us move on. Looking at the time, let us move on to the next topic. And this is an interesting topic because it is about the rise of ISDS. And let me tell you, I knew nothing about this maybe 10 years ago. And still today, whenever you talk of ISDS, whenever you talk of this BITs, people struggle to understand. Everybody has heard of commercial arbitration, but moment you talk about investment treaty arbitration, somehow the eyes glaze over. But we are very fortunate because we have with us Vikram, who has an extremely diverse practice. And particularly in arbitration, I've had the privilege of appearing on the other side, maybe I don't remember, 10 years ago in an arbitration. He's a formidable opponent, but of course a very good friend. And he's the ideal person to turn to tell us a little about, the rise of ISDS and what the impact it has had. So we have a broad overview and understanding as to the next legal trends in this rather unusual and esoteric field. So Vikram, over to you.
Thank you, Gaurav, and privileged to be part of this panel. I think I endorse your views and Hemant Kumar's views on the arbitration seeing the good days, and hopefully we will have very good practices being followed. That said, I also endorse your view that this particular topic is still an unknown animal in India. But I think this is the right time, and I think the organizers have chosen the most opportune moment to discuss this topic, given the focus on ease of doing business in India, given the policies such as Atmanirbhar and production-linked investments incentives, PLI. It's time that this particular topic must get its due recognition and attention, which it has not so far received. Let me get into a little bit of a historical background as far as this topic is concerned. So as we all know, India is not a signatory to ICSID, which is the convention which is world over followed for investor protection. And probably the reasons for India not signing the ICSID convention is somewhere there was a feeling that it's a pro-developed country forum, so protects only the big and the mighty. And India, being a developing country, at least back in the days when this topic was being discussed, they felt that they would be not receiving the right treatment and the justice. So that's, I think, one reason. And like every developing country, you would be nervous to hand over your sovereign power to a foreign tribunal, without people getting in bash at the local courts and the local, testing it under the local law. So that probably was the reason why India, I mean, this is my guess that they did not sign the ICSID convention. But, as things evolve, the first blow, I suppose, came when the White Industries case, the Australian case, was decided against India, primarily for the reason that delay in Indian courts was a fetter on the investors and really gave the investor the raw deal, especially when an arbitration award, which had attained finality, was not being honored. So that was the beginning of, I suppose that was the first alarm bell, if I may call it, for the government to sit up and look at BITs a little more closely. But what happened as a result of that award being against the government of India was rather a knee-jerk reaction instead of trying to, put itself in the international map. They, in 2017, as we know, India cancelled all its BITs. Virtually about 60 odd BITs were cancelled, and although India, I think, has a total number of 85 or 86 BITs signed, and out of that, about 60 were terminated in 2017. And a new model, a bilateral investment treaty, was put up there on the Indian government's website. And some of the clauses really do sort of make you feel that it's one-sided, in the sense it's surely that India wants to be the dominant player. India recognizes that today it's a hot haven for investment. Look at the way our stock market is going, despite everything being told, COVID, pandemic, and force measure and things like that. It's still very hot, largely because money is flowing into India for whatever reasons. And, without getting too critical about how the money is flowing and why it's flowing, it's flowing. And because it's flowing, the stock market is looking good. And that really, I suppose, is in India's favor to say that if you are going to negotiate with me at the table, as far as the bilateral investment treaties are concerned, I am going to now have a voice and I'm going to have a say. So in the model BIT, what India has done is to abandon the international standard, which was kind of a thumb rule of fair and equitable treatment. And this was as broad as it could get, because fair and equitable treatment, you could push 6 horses and a course through it, depending on, how you perceive matters. And that's precisely what happened in White Industries case. So they have, in the model BIT, done away with this universal test, or called the FET, the fair and equitable test, and instead introduce specific tests. I wouldn't say that they are the clearest of clear expressions, but at least not as broad as the fair and equitable treatment. So today we have tests like denial of justice, fundamental breach of due process, probably an extension of Article 21, then certain discriminatory actions, again, the shadow of Article 14 looming large. These are now specific actions which can trigger the arbitration under a bilateral treaty. And I suppose the growing power of India is best demonstrated in the last BIT, which was signed with Brazil sometime in 2020, where today that treaty does not provide for investor-state arbitration. It provides for state and state arbitration. So this is a big departure from the conventional BITs that we have seen, and it leaves the investor only with local remedies. So maybe good news for all of us on this panel, and we could be smiling. But at the end of the day, the investor has to first go through the motions of exhausting his remedies within the national jurisdiction, go to the municipal courts, and thereafter he would have to approach his government, and his government would then, through its joint committee and a designated authority, take cudgels with the government of India. So at the end of the day, it will be government versus government, and not an investor versus the state. Something similar, which I've had some experience of in my earlier avatar, thanks to one of my partners, then partners, doing a lot of these work with the WTO, World Trade Organization. And typically, World Trade Organization, where the member countries have free trade agreements, those free trade agreements have a clause where if there is a dispute with regard to the validity of a certificate issued for tax purposes, and this would be trade in goods, because WTO is World Trade Organization concerned with goods and services. So if you look at a typical free trade agreement, it could be India with the ASEAN countries or India with any other country. It will provide for a dispute resolution mechanism at the national level. So you can't just deny an individual importer or an individual exporter the benefit until and unless there is a determination at the highest possible level. One interesting feature which is part of our model BIT, and again this takes a leap from what's happening when there was a lot of criticism about investments flowing in from Mauritius, and that is that the model BIT now has a requirement of qualification in terms of the definition of the investor, that the investor should have substantial business activities in the home state. Now you understand why this is so, because you don't want shell companies being set up somewhere, companies which have no economic substance at all, set up only to channelize some money, and if I were to use a popular expression by many investigating agencies, the laundered money coming in. And therefore, if India were to extend protection to an investor, it wants to ensure that it has got a robust presence in its own home country. And this is to discourage investments coming in from countries like Mauritius, Cyprus, etc. But I think that we can end on a happier note. And a happier note is this, that India is being proactive as far as investor disputes are concerned. With Nissan, the automobile company, they settled the dispute when one of the state governments had denied certain tax incentives to them. And although Nissan dragged Indian government was able to persuade the state government to settle amounts in excess of 200 million. And now the latest which we have heard is that India has introduced a new amendment in the act to roll back the famous or infamous retrospective amendment to overcome Vodafone judgment. And this is a very big step that the Indian government has taken, and a huge signal to the world outside that, we are here proactively going to encourage you setting up shop in India. And that is why, these kind of measures we are open to. I think it's a bold step which the government has taken, and certainly it will augur well for times to come. Thank you, Gaurav, for giving me the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. Actually, I was going to ask you this question, but you've already answered the question. I wanted to know your views on this new amendment which has been brought in, and you mentioned that Nissan has been settled. Of course, I think these are very positive moves, and hopefully we should not end up in too many BIT arbitrations. I've had some experience of them. I will hold my horses on that, and I will turn now to Ganesh for some comments, because he has a Singaporean stroke Indian view on this. So we'd love to hear what you have to say, Ganesh, about this topic.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Vikram, for setting the stage. I'll just, I think he has covered very well the history of how, about our BITs, how we canceled the BITs in India, and the latest model BIT as well. Of course, the Singaporean India view, the only thing is Singapore is a party to ICSID, India is not. So India has not signed the ICSID convention, and we have all these BITs, but obviously about 58 of them have been, we've given notice of termination. But the recent developments which Vikram just mentioned about the settlement in the Nissan case, I had a very, very cursory involvement in the Nissan case. I can say that now because it's settled in the initial stages, but of course, the matter is settled right now. But I can tell you the view taken by the officers of the government now is very, I think it's very pro-investor as well, except that, I mean, many people criticize our model BIT, which we issued in 2016. I'm sure some of the aspects there, like, exhausting local remedies for 5 years and all that is a little too much, even I feel. But I guess India is also a country which was earlier we were capital importing country, but we have, at least in the last decade, I think we have become, we are becoming a capital exporting country. So India wants to position itself in terms of its sovereignty. And I guess that's where this model BIT is coming from. And at the end of the day, if parties are negotiating and they can come up with something, it'll be good. But of course, at the moment, we have Belarus and few other countries. And Vikram was mentioning about the Brazil, and I also read something about the entities in Taiwan, an association in Taiwan, and an association in India entering into some kind of an arrangement. So these are all developments which are happening, which is very good. In fact, foreign investment is extremely important. It's not this India is being sued. Many of the Indian investors are suing foreign countries as well in investment treaty regimes and in other BITs. So there are a handful of such cases. But I agree completely with Vikram that the recent initiative by the government in terms of the Vodafone to overcome the retrospective kind of a ruling is a very welcome step, though it might be a big,
Ganesh, can I then, looking at the sort of timing of this, can I move on to a not so pleasant talk? Because we are all saying that BITs are great, government is behaving and settling matters, etc. I think this is an opportune time to move on to the next slightly more controversial topic. And I can see Tejas is beaming and waiting his turn. So
yeah.
we looking at the sort of dynamics, let us move on to a very, very controversial case which excites all sides. And unfortunately, I have also been involved in that dispute at various stages. And this is the famous or infamous dispute, depending on how you couch it, between Antrix and Devas. And Antrix, I didn't realize what Antrix was. Then I finally figured out Antrix means Antriksh or space. But everybody calls it Antrix. I have no idea why. But Antrix versus Devas, it is a case which is a lawyer's delight. And I'm sure it is not at all a happy situation either for the government or for the investors. We've had a judgment yesterday from the NCLAT on one aspect. So I don't want to take away Tejas's thunder. We have known him grow in the arbitration field, and he's one of our superstars in India and abroad. So I think I will at least be happy to hear from him more about what his views on this particular case are. Over to you, Tejas.
Sorry, Gaurav, before Tejas starts, may I just take leave of everybody? Because for personal reasons, as we note that today there is a public holiday in Maharashtra. So I would like to
joining us.
Make a Antrix exit. Thank you.
We will miss you, but wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thanks. All the best.
Yes.
See you, Vikram. See you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, Tejas.
Yes, Mr. Banerjee, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Legal Era, for giving us opportunity to host this session. And coming to the topic for today is this very, very interesting case and specially treated case of Antrix versus Devas. It's almost a decade-old saga and still continuing. I don't know how long. But it has twisted and turned a lot of aspects of arbitration law, both in the commercial arbitration field and the bilateral investment treaty arbitration. And it could be a very good test case for law students to understand how the arbitration can be used or misused, or the law can trump the arbitration, because it's something, it's a matter which has issues like comity between two courts, how the enforcement will work, how the courts can stop enforcement, how you can completely avoid enforcement. So before that, let me give you some background about this case for the delegates who have no background. I'm sure everybody has it. So this is a case which dates back to a contract in 2005. This was a case where Devas was incorporated in December of 2004. and a contract was entered into January of 2005. Everything went well for 6 years. This was for a 90% transponder space on 2 satellites made by ISRO, and ISRO is a Government of India organization, Indian Space Research Organization in Bangalore, and they had the arm Antrix, which is called Antrix by our foreign friends. In 2011, there was a report of CAG, which came up with an finding that there was a fraud and there was a misappropriation and there was a money laundering, pursuant to which Antrix cancelled and terminated the contract with Devas. In 2016, there was a FIR filed in the criminal investigation started against the officials of Devas and Antrix both. And after 2011, there were 3 arbitrations. So one was a commercial arbitration in ICC and 2 bilateral investment treaty arbitration by the shareholders of Devas. One was in Permanent Court of Arbitration in PCA Hague, and the other was in Deutsche arbitration, where the 2 of the arbitrations resulted in $101 and $111 million award against India. In 2015, the ICC tribunal again gave an award against Antrix, saying that the contract was illegally terminated and the damages was awarded to the tune of US dollars 672 million. Now, this was so far so good. This just gives you a background of the facts, but then the story begins now. When Devas went for enforcement of this in various jurisdictions, in US, in India, all of assets were being attached. In the Indian Supreme Court also was involved, but Antrix filed a setting aside proceedings under Section 34 of arbitration because the seat of arbitration is in New Delhi. Although the venue was in London, but the seat was in Delhi. So the Indian court had the jurisdiction. Part 1 of the act applied. And the Indian court started looking into it, but instead of filing the case before Delhi High Court, the 34 was filed before the Bangalore City Civil Court because of the registered office was of Antrix was in Bangalore. It was challenged. The Supreme Court then stayed the setting aside proceedings before Bangalore City Civil Court, and ultimately it transferred the matter to Delhi High Court. But interestingly, on 4th of November 2020, and there's quite an interesting date which coincides with our 2021 amendment which was made by the Indian government. The date was coinciding, where the Supreme Court said that, look, it is quite strange that the award is getting set aside before Delhi High Court, but you are proceeding against with the enforcement. Until such time the Indian court decides the application for stay of the enforcement, there would be, the award will be put in abeyance and it will not be enforced over anywhere in the world. This was quite a unique order by the Supreme Court, and very same day there was an ordinance which was passed saying that the Indian courts can grant and shall grant a unconditional stay, that is without deposit of any money, for an award which for the underlying contract or the award was vitiated by fraud or corruption. Now, there is a background to this amendment. In 2015, we amended our act to clarify that moment you file a challenge against an award in India, there is no automatic stay. You have to specifically ask the court, and the court can then grant stay against the enforcement. If you deposit, if it is a money award, then you have to deposit certain portion of the award before the court. And that's what everybody was talking, Mr. Hemant Kumar was also referring to that, is that now the regime has changed in last 6 years. The arbitration which we were talking that, oh, it is a burdensome and cumbersome, this thing has changed because parties are not challenging the awards at the drop of the hat because they have to deposit the money if they have to. But with this amendment which is brought in, and we know the timing can tell who knows what's the real reason. But if we put the things together, it has opened a floodgate. According to me, this amendment had an intention, but the effect of this amendment has led to a lot of consequences, which we will just discuss about. Apart from that, a very interesting thing also happened is that Antrix filed a case before NCLT in Bangalore for winding up of Devas. And this is also a very interesting thing because under section 271 of the Companies Act, there is a provision that if winding up proceedings can be filed if the conduct of the business of a company is run in a fraudulent manner or the company has been incorporated for the fraudulent purpose. And the argument was that when Devas was incorporated, it was for laundering the money and there was a conflict of interest and the officers of Antrix and Devas were hand in glove. And in fact, Devas dragged the arbitration to London and tried to take the jurisdiction away from Indian court, and therefore everything was in the purpose of fraudulent manner, and NCLT wound up Devas and appointed an official liquidator. Official liquidator then filed an application before the US court where the enforcement proceedings were pending pursuant to an ICC award to not press for the enforcement because all our Air India and other assets were getting attached because of this award which was getting enforced, because India is a New York Convention country, and as a New York Convention country you can enforce the award in all the signatory countries of New York Convention because it's an international foreign award as far as that is concerned. This also throws open a lot of issues with regard to committee of courts because the US courts will have to consider whether the order passed by the Supreme Court putting the award in abeyance, is it a binding order? Because New York Convention Article 5, 1, he says that the award may be enforced or if may not be enforced if the award is either suspended or set aside by the place at which the award is made, or it is declared to be not enforceable. So now we have to see that whether the Supreme Court order, which is again an interim order, it is not a final order till such time the Delhi High Court decides. And again, that matter is still pending before Delhi High Court. So we have to wait and watch and see what Delhi High Court does as far as that application for stay is concerned. But with this 2001 amendment, now we can see that the Delhi High Court has an ability to stay the award without deposit of any money by Antrix because the underlying theme of the contract or the award was vitiated by fraud. Now coming back to the whole issue is that there are issues with regard to the committee. There are issues with regard to this 2001-21 amendment and also winding up proceedings. And yesterday, as Mr. Banerjee said, NCLT has dismissed the appeal against the order passed by the NCLT Bangalore, winding up Devas. So now there are two concurrent findings of NCLT and NCLT, National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, both upholding that the Devas should be wound up. And now both are Indian companies. It was a domestic arbitration having seat in India. The venue was in London, but the NCLT has passed observations saying that because the Indian court was removed, the jurisdiction was removed from Indian territory and was taken to London, this was a fraudulent act. Now that has been put, a rubber stamp of NCLT has been put on that just yesterday. Now we have to see what Supreme Court does, but maybe the writing is on the wall that what is going to happen because you have concurrent finding and Supreme Court normally doesn't interfere into these issues. So we have to see that what is happening with regard to this case, which has been treated differently. But what has happened as a result is that the 2021 amendment, which is brought in by the legislature, has a lot of issues which we have to grapple with in the times to come. Because what would happen is that although you have not taken this issue of fraud before the arbitral tribunal, and in this case also, what Antrix has said at the time of termination is force majeure and not fraud, because they were not aware about the fraud when they terminated the contract. So when you are not terminating the contract for fraud, but you can resist the enforcement on the ground of fraud. Now, fraud has to be pleaded specifically and proved. Now, whether the enforcement court, which cannot go behind the award, can the court come to a conclusion that the contract was entered into because of as a result of fraud, or whether the award was vitiated by fraud? These are the issues which will have to be seen in the times to come. Then the very important aspect, which is this amendment has been made retrospective. Although the arbitration started in 2015 and the contract was terminated in 2011, all the matters now will be governed by this new 2021 amendment. So irrespective of whether the petition for setting aside was filed prior or subsequent to the 2015 amendments. It is now applicable to all the cases which were filed even prior to that. So this amendment applies to this case. We have to see whether Delhi High Court grants a stay or unconditional stay or not, whether Supreme Court upholds the binding of Devas or not. But in my view, this is something which has kind of changed the whole landscape of arbitration, where the pro-arbitration approach of Indian courts is to, once you have an award, you will not interfere with the award. Or if you have an award, you will the enforcement court cannot go behind the award. All these are slightly diluted in my view. Maybe this is a genuine case. I really don't know, because if the facts are so that you have a finding of fraud by the law enforcement agencies and you don't want to pay this amount, but there are 3 awards, 2 awards in bilateral investment treaty arbitration and 1 in the commercial arbitration, where Entrix did not appoint the arbitrator and then ICC appointed the arbitrator on behalf of Entrix, but Entrix did not object to it. And the US court has now upheld the award also, and in trying to enforce this award. An Indian Supreme Court putting the award in abeyance. Now we have to see whether which court will prevail, either US court will prevail or Indian court will prevail. So this throws open a lot of issues which may be debated over a period of time. But I'll pause here, and I would like to also hear from Mr. Banerjee, because he was deeply involved in various aspects of this matter. And although he's moderating, we all requested him to share his thoughts, which he was reluctant to, but I think we have prevailed over him and he has agreed to share his thoughts with us.
So I've been trapped into this, and since time is running out, I can take that advantage by saying time is running out, but I will definitely say something about.
Oh, that's great.
I'll definitely say, since you described that order as unique, I was also party to that order. I had appeared on that date. So you know, this is a very difficult case, and hard cases make bad law. The problem here is that there is a definite difference of perception. One perception is that you must respect ICC awards, you must respect BIT awards. That is one perception which most of us have, and that is perhaps why the Nissan matter got settled, the Vodafone amendment came. That is a very important aspect. But this case, for some reason, and I can now confidently say that because I am no longer really involved with this. I was involved earlier. For some reason, the government has taken the view, and it is now supported by the NCLAT, which is a 350 odd page judgment, which I was trying to read yesterday, and I got through it. It makes interesting reading. What happens when the public interest in upholding awards clashes with the public interest, which is uncovering fraud and illegality? It's a very tricky balance, and you can have different views on it. So what was the reason for the amendment? My lips are sealed. I cannot say anything about what was the reason for the amendment. I don't think, unlike Mr. Karya, that it will have any great impact on other matters, because fraud is difficult to prove. This is an unusual case where you've got a verdict of fraud. Of course, it is covered subsequently. But my concern is something else. My concern is, regardless of who is right or wrong, whether Devas is right, whether the government is right, today the claim against the government is over $1 billion, nearly 9,000 crores. If the government loses, I mean, those 9,000 crores are really our money. There was an attempt at settlement a few years ago, and it really does bother me, because the award of 672 million, frankly, according to me, was just far too high. If you look at the other awards of the BITs, which Mr. Karya Tejas mentioned, 100 million, 111 million, maybe at a stretch possible, which is about 700-800 crores, maybe. Even that I would say is on the high side. But when you get hit with an award of $672 million, which is 5,000-6,000 crores, somewhere you lose faith in the system. you just think that, and there is a real issue of very, very large awards coming in BITs, which sometimes developed countries just can't swallow. This is not a Vodafone case or a Ken case where the quantum was set. It was 1.2 billion. That was the tax. Here, this is speculative damages of a company with 12 people who didn't really do much. I'm not going into the facts. So there is this tension between pro-arbitration and a country which feels maybe in some way that there is some hanky-panky. So I think this will have to play itself out. It's not going to be an easy solution. And you can understand why Devas will go against assets abroad. That's what the New York Convention says. But I don't think this is a case where, unlike Nissan, unlike Vodafone, unlike Ken, the government will back down, because they genuinely feel, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, whatever NCLAT is, they genuinely feel there is some hanky-panky. So I think we leave it there. And
Do you think there will be a third BIT arbitration?
There may be a third BIT, but then you see this will go on and on. It is in everybody's interest to settle it. But if there is criminality involved, I don't know how it will settle. That's the problem. The problem is the element of criminality, which is now alleged. There is a Cloyver blog which suggests third arbitration based on expropriation of award. So I don't know that I think you will be in a better position to answer what Devas thinks. So I think we have run out of time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ganesh, for those insightful comments. Mr. Hemant Kumar, on your practical insights, and Tejas, of course, summarizing a very complicated litigation in 5 minutes. I don't think I could have done it. Thank you, everybody. It's been a real pleasure. May I hand over back to Shikha? Sorry to have overrun the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Firstly, I would like to say, Gaurav, that thank you to you and the panel for the lovely camaraderie that we sort of witnessed, very candidly on the screen amongst all the FIRST-EU. And thank you to you as well as the very involved panel, I should say, for, I think, very passionately discussing the arbitration next legal trends. So thank you very much.